Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. My guest today is Kelly Sawin, who is a poet, mom, gardener, and Twitter user, of course, like so many of the guests on this program. Thank you
Yes.
for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really honored.
And we started talking on Twitter.
Yes.
How have you been on Twitter, Law?
I have been on Twitter sort of on and off for a long time. I think I've been following you, gosh, I don't even know, maybe a year or two, maybe a couple of years at this point. But yeah, I'm sort of on again, off again. I have an ambivalent relationship with it. But I stay because, you make good contacts with people and especially, I'm currently a stay-at-home mom. And so you end up connecting with other moms and, it feels a little bit less solitary that way.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned having followed me for a couple of years. It's one of the interesting things that I've thought about over the years is just like how long I have been mutuals with some people. I think I've been mutuals with some people for, well, close to 15 years, probably 12 or 13 years that I've had those relationships that have existed solely on Twitter. It's an interesting development. And I think that's something that's kind of unique about that platform that I don't know necessarily. I don't know if I can't imagine that other platforms quite do the same thing, like allow you to establish long-standing relationships like that. What makes you have a love-hate relationship with it?
Um, well, I I think it's very beneficial. I think there's a lot of good that comes from it. As I said, you make really great connections there with people that you might not have encountered in your real life. The ambivalency comes from the fact that sometimes I think it's maybe not very good for the soul. I think that I think excessive use can sort of scatter your brain and your attention. I also think that sometimes it can amplify the more extreme voices among us and make it so that we think that the world is a little bit more black and white and extreme than it really is. If you're not on Twitter and you're going about your daily life, things are pretty okay. Your neighbors are your neighbors. They're good people, whether you disagree with them or not. But on Twitter, you really get to see some of the worst of the human heart. And some very, very black and white thinking and reactivity. And I think it can make you a little bit more nervous walking through the world, that perhaps the world is a little bit more extreme and a little bit more polarized than it really is. And I think that that's not very healthy if it starts to feel that way.
I think Twitter is not a place for nuance.
No, it's not.
I've had several people tell me that Twitter is really a place for it's really a place for content that doesn't demand a lot of thinking, is a gentle way of saying. So, so I just have decided that whenever I see someone who's more successful on that platform than I am, I just assume it's because they don't have my nuance and sophistication.
That's one way you could think about it. I mean, that's one of the more lamentable things about it is like the people who are more thoughtful and careful and wise are not, posting as prolifically, or what they do post is maybe not those thoughtful analyses of things. I find your account very refreshing because I think that you are very insightful in what you post. You don't post a lot, but when you do, it's often very insightful and thoughtful. And that's a little bit different than the usual Twitter landscape. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I'd like to. I haven't posted a lot in the last few months, but I'd like to do more. So you on? Do you follow poets on there?
I do. I sort of, when I started my account, I've more intentionally like not used it for poetry. I don't even have poet listed in my Twitter bio. Even though, that's what I'm trained in, that's what I do. I use it a little bit more for posting about motherhood and being a wife and just the funny things that happen. And I don't use it very seriously, I think.
You say you're trained in? Did you go to poet school?
Poet school, yeah, I did.
What was that
Yeah,
like?
I had. What? I'm sorry. What was your
What was
question?
that like?
Oh, it was good. So it's what I have. I have both my undergraduate degree in it and my graduate degree in it. And
Specifically in what? Like in literature or creative writing or what?
So my undergraduate was English with a concentration in poetry writing. There's a specific, it's called the area program in poetry writing. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was basically like an MFA for undergrads.
Oh, wow.
And I got so much out of it. I feel
Where
like
is that?
UVA, University of Virginia. It's a great program, great program. And I don't think there's an undergrad program like it, really. It's why I went there. And then I got my MFA from Hollins University. And I really liked that program because of the way it was structured, which is that they didn't focus so much on like literary theory. It was more studio based. So they gave you just a ton of time to write and they demanded a high output. And that's the way you sharpen your writing skills, really, is just by doing it and by doing a lot of it. So I got a lot out of both programs, I think.
Probably my favorite poet is William Stafford. I don't know if you're familiar with his work or not, but he wrote a poem every morning for about 45 years.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot of unpublished work. But but it was just a daily discipline, and it's just so interesting to think that there were mornings where at 4 o'clock in the morning he literally just got up and wrote a masterpiece of 20th century American literature.
Yep.
And then went and made coffee or whatever. It's funny.
I love that. And you do that, don't you? You try to write a poem a day, or you go through phases of it?
I was doing that for a while, and life kind of got in the way, and I sort of focused on some other things. And I'm probably writing one or two a week right now. But here, when things settle down, it's a very useful discipline, I think. To it's interesting. I watched an interview with Robert Bly, whose work I also like very much, who was very close friends with William Stafford. And he said in the interview that after William Stafford died, he adopted the practice of writing a poem every morning. And in the interview, he said, I wrote a bad one this morning. And I think, writing a poem every day, what's good about that is it lets you get the bad ones out of the way.
Yes. Yes, underrated. Sometimes you have it just kind of sitting there and you have to clear it out to get the good ones out following it. I agree with that.
What is your writing process like?
My writing process, pretty similar, although I think I go through seasons. So I'll
try to write a poem a day?
If possible. I have small children. So
they've got one done today yet?
No. So when I say I go through seasons, what I'm referring to is the fact that for the last several years, I keep having a pregnancy and then having a baby, and then having a pregnancy and then having a baby. And what I've discovered is that
a poem out of that.
Well, I do, but when I'm pregnant, I can't write at all. My brain is just a fried egg and nothing. I can't. And that used to distress me, like with my first pregnancy. But now I just know that that's my rhythm. And then usually a few months postpartum is when I'm able to write again and it comes pouring out. And that's when I'm writing about, either a poem a day or, one or two a week, depending on how much my children let me write.
I like my brain as a fried egg as an opening line.
That could work as an opening line. It could. You're welcome to use it.
Well, I don't think I would be describing my pregnancies.
Well, you wouldn't, but
Right.
maybe some other experience.
So, what about publications? What's your publication history like?
I'm in various literary magazines, here and there around.
Mhm.
My I'm currently sending out a manuscript. I've sent it to some contests. It's been a finalist. It's been a semifinalist. But now I'm just kind of sending it around to different publishers. I'm very slow about publishing. I'm not somebody I don't feel a lot of pressure around publishing. I think there's some poets that, they write a poem and then they send it off and they publish it. And I'm really not like that. I think because I write very quickly.
Mhm.
And so I'll just like write and write and write. And then, every 6 or 8 months, I'll be like, I should probably send something off.
Mhm.
But it's not something I feel a lot of pressure about usually.
Mhm.
I think that kind of relates to like the question of like why we write and like, why certain poems come into the world versus others. I think a lot of the time I'm writing as like a internal processing, um, a way of processing things internally. And
Say
then
more about that. How is it internal if you're writing it?
well, I say internal, maybe just that it's like a way of ordering sort of what's going on inside of me.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm somebody that historically I've struggled with like really being in touch with what I'm thinking and feeling about things. I'll just kind of feel like there's something going on and I don't know what it is. And writing is a way of putting that somewhere external, and being able to then see it ordered and understand what's going on. And so I think a lot of my writing is born from that place. Not all of it. Less now. I think now
Mm-hmm.
I write a little bit more in terms of what I'm processing intellectually. But historically, it's been a lot of like, hey, I'm feeling something, and what is going on here? And let me put it on a page, and then I can read it and know what's going on.
When you're actually writing a poem, what is that like for you? Is it hard work?
Mm, I wouldn't describe it as hard work. I wouldn't describe it as hard work. It's more relieving, I think.
Hmm.
Um,
Can you tell when you're writing a poem whether it's going to be a good one or a bad one by the way it feels?
yes,
Yes, so can I. I find that interesting.
yes. I think if it feels hard and like it's not working, and I'm trying to fit things together, that's a poem that's not usually working very well. If it flows a little bit more freely, that's usually a poem that's going to work.
When
I
I am
don't
writing a
know.
bad poem, I feel like I'm writing it. When
Yes.
I feel like when I'm writing a poem that's going to be pretty decent, I feel like it has arrived to me.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I say about my the poetry collection that I wrote for my MFA thesis.
Mhm.
I joke that like I wrote it in my sleep because
Mhm.
it would just like it was almost like it was just coming to me. Like I would wake up in the morning and the wheels had been turning, and I would just have to put it on the paper.
Mhm.
And that one was interesting because that was sort of just like I just sort of opened myself up psychologically to like what are the sense perceptions, what are the memories related to this subject that I'm writing about, and just sort of letting it come out. And so in that way, it feels like it's just coming.
Mhm.
And I think even the last manuscript that I wrote, the one that I'm sending out now, was a lot like that, where it was just like, what's related to this subject that I'm writing about? What are the sense memories and the perceptions and the things that are still bothering me about it, and just letting that come out.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably why I say I write quickly, because when I do that, it just comes.
And Are you a formal poet, or are you sort of more free verse oriented, do you think?
Definitely more free verse oriented. I usually have some kind of ordering principle, but it really looks a lot like free verse. Like I'll usually try to keep the same number of beats in a line, but I'm not writing in iams. I'm not using meter. I'm not necessarily rhyming, although I think you do end up, you use formal principles here and there, even in free verse, but it's not, it's not as systematic as formal verse.
I didn't ask you about this beforehand. Do you have a poem you'd like to read?
Of mine?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't expect that question.
I hadn't thought of it until just now. So
another thing about the way I write is that I write in long series. So my poems, like when I write like a book, it's a book that you would read start to finish. And the poems, there's like a narrative arc usually. I mean, I have ones that stand alone. I have plenty that stand alone, but that complicates my ability to just read a standalone poem.
I see. Okay.
But I mean, I could try to pull something up if you
would like to, that would be great. But if you would prefer not to, I certainly don't want to pressure you.
Well, I would have to look around. I mean, I could always just read the beginning of my manuscript that I'm sending on.
Sure. If that's handy, let's hear it.
Let's see. So the book is called This Most Mortal Garden.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Thank you. And it follows a woman who, gosh, how would I describe it? It follows a woman, through, I think, all of the transformations that happen when you become a wife and a mother, and sort of wrestles with those transformations theologically in a lot of cases. And draws heavily on garden imagery and the Garden of Eden and sort of the fall and the fact that we're now living in this broken, fallen world, looking toward redemption at the end of all things. So that's the book. The first poem is titled Dawn.
Yes.
And I'm going to read it if my computer would cooperate. All right, Dawn. First came worms and then the birds. Goldfinches hung like beads on sunflowers, plucking seeds and dropping their husks, spent beneath leaves on cucumbers' hidden fruit. Accepting the tithe, the seeds exegeted, exhaled and blown. In the morning, they all breathed deeper, and the woman could hear the plant breath, the pant of leaves heavy bent from rest. It had been a city yard, but she turned the soil from dust to loam. In the morning, the mushrooms were not yet shyly hidden. They lifted their moist chins, pride of their night growth, tipped up toward the first thumb-sized apricot ripening on a branch. The melon hidden in its rainforest of leaves, slime mold biting the air with its smoke when she stepped on it. All still wrapped in the thin blue of morning. And morning sang, the lark or the nightingale. Neither here, only the muted burble of traffic at this hour, only the occasional shout from the gas station across the street, but fenced by sunflowers and gowned in the growing gold light. Her husband asleep in the house, asleep to the carrots twisting their way darkwards, the potatoes swelling unseen, the swales she dug gathering their water, flood in a bowl she dug, garden in a square she dug. It, at least, was something the light could touch, something her skin could touch. Because the man in the bed, who? The sun, rising in the east. You can catch a slivered, I just lost my place. You can catch a slivered moon of it behind the power lines, behind the cloud brightening, the cloud went manic contained therein. The birds darted between rows, too quick to name, all gray, the sudden burst of wing and ecstasy, an ejaculation, a mouth opening O and then twisting to S, to a hiss. She watched the kinetic burst, and it made her think of mitochondria, all the tiny machines ticking along in her cells. She could not see them or touch them, and this pained her. Wet grass only on her calves if she sat. She sat. She made it a prayer, and it was a silent one, and thus it was a fair prayer. The house was tall and too close to the garden. The house blocked the sky. The house was gray-green, a color not a color, the only color she had no name for. The paint was peeling and screamingly poor. There were windows, though. They rapped at the air. Attention. She would have to go back inside. She would be called back inside. The man was there on the stoop, holding her baby with his fat little onesie and his fat little legs, and he, the baby, made her burst as the sun does into a new day, because there was a baby, and the baby should feel this light. She should take the baby from the man in the house and let him feel this light. She took the baby from the man and carried him toward the fresh green day, where he reached for a tomato still orange in its newness. And as he took a bite, she knew the day was coming. The day would be hot. The day would be wider than windows and air and night's extended arms, and the baby, yes, the baby would eat this sun.
It was lovely. Yeah, she doesn't sound entirely happy.
Yeah, you're perceptive.
I suppose throughout the rest of the poems, she deals with that in some way.
Yes, she does. It's interesting because I started writing this. I hadn't written anything in a long time before I started writing this, and I started writing after we had our first baby, and it sort of how I described earlier, where like sometimes I'm not totally sure what I'm feeling, and there's just something wrong, and writing helps me figure that out. That was definitely the case with this project. I had a very hard time postpartum. I've had a hard time postpartum with both of my after both of my pregnancies. But with this one, I didn't know that I was having a hard time. And me and my husband ended up sort of having a crisis at that time. Because I was having a hard time, and our marriage started having a hard time, and it sort of imploded a little bit, and I started to write, and I started writing it, and I thought that I was writing about how that my marriage is bad, and my husband is terrible to me. And I wrote it, I just let it come out, and then I was able to look at it and realize, oh no, this isn't about it's not that my marriage is bad. It's not that my husband is terrible. My husband is actually wonderful, by the way. This is a story about a woman having a very hard time postpartum. And in that case, it was so much anxiety and feeling, sort of stuck, and all those things that when women have a hard time postpartum, they feel. And so writing it sort of helped me discern that, and then as time went on, process through it, and ultimately reach that point of rebuilding and redemption that follows the same arc as like the Garden of Eden falling, and then in Revelation it's rebuilt and it's made beautiful again.
When you're writing a poem, how much do you think about the reader?
That's a very good question. It probably depends. Usually not very much.
Yes, same here.
I think it's really healthy to not think very much about your audience, because I think to write good poetry, you have to be very, very honest and, really let what you're wrestling with onto the page. And, sometimes we can be a little bit captive to an audience, I think. So it helps to not even, when I write, I'm not thinking that I'm going to even show this to someone necessarily. And that's usually when the best poetry happens.
It's interesting. I saw Billy Collins in a talk in a video where he talked a lot about poetry as a blend of the sort of straightforward and the mysterious.
Yes.
And I felt that was very helpful to me, because it's a lot of a lot of permission to be mysterious, and that in a lot of my favorite poems, it's sort of difficult to know exactly what's being talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned William Stafford. Probably my favorite poem of his is called Ask Me, and it ends with the line, "What the river says, that is what I say."
Mm-hmm.
Now, we don't know what the river says, right? There's some clues in the poem, but it's part of that. It's the mysteriousness that makes the poem valuable in a way. It makes it something that you could think about for years.
Yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what invites not just layers of meaning, but it's almost like poetry keeps things open to the transcendent, to, things that are larger than just like, if you're writing an essay, you're looking to state things and conclude.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think a poem is a little bit truer to like how we actually move through the world, which is, we're in a concrete world and we're experiencing sense perceptions. And I think that we do really think metaphorically and associatively. And so poetry really like demonstrates, I think, the way that like we actually reason, which is sensorially and, in the space between the imagination and the intellect. I think that's partly why it's so good at like getting to the truth of experiences. And often they are left open, like you have an experience and you can interpret it, but really, you've had the experience with the person or the object or whatever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Would it be presumptuous of me to ask if I could read you one of my poems?
Oh, please do. I would love to. I haven't actually read any of your poetry, and
That's
I'd love
because
to.
none of them have been made public except this one, which I'm about to make public.
Well, please do.
This is the most recent one, and it's very short. And I have made full use of my permission to be mysterious. So
Okay.
we can talk about it because it may not be immediately accessible to anyone but me. Okay. It's called March 24th, 2001. A family from Utah complains their vacation was troubled by the sighting of a pterodactyl. The scaly bird gave them nightmares. In Ohio, that man calls the deputies, begging for help because Sasquatch, descended from the pungent woods, have laid their hands dark upon his trailer to rock it like a cradle. And on the mound, Johnson whines, seeking the K, but kills instead a dove, a sacrifice to our incredulity. Impossible things happen every day. A light from heaven opens and ascends again.
Oh, I think that's marvelous. Thank you.
Mysterious. And you may not know, but I'm referring in a way in that last stanza, to a real incident that occurred on March 24th, 2001, when pitcher for the Arizona Diamondbacks, Randy Johnson, threw a baseball at about 104 miles an hour. And in the 3/4 of a second it takes to get from the mound to the plate, a dove out of nowhere flew in front of the baseball, collided with it, and exploded.
Wow.
Okay, so he killed a dove with a baseball. And the statisticians who have run the odds are say that the chances of that happening are about 1 in 13 million. But impossible things happen every day.
Right.
Right.
That is the stuff of poetry, isn't it? A
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And
104-mile-per-hour baseball exploding a dove.
right. And so, yeah. And so I liked being mysterious there about that. And I guess my point is it more or less likely 1 in 13 million that there's a Bigfoot out there? I mean, if a guy can accidentally
More
kill a
likely.
bird with a baseball, I don't know why there can't be a giant ape that lives in the woods.
I'm tempted to weigh in on Bigfoot, but
Go for it. That's
I think I sort of believe in Bigfoot a little bit, but
uh-huh. Why wouldn't you?
yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's a website when I was, I've shared that I've been very sick recently and I was
Uh-huh.
in bed for a long time. And one of the things that I did when I was in bed was I found a website that lists all the Bigfoot sightings across the United States. People can go in there and list them. I looked in
Mhm.
my area for all the Bigfoot sightings, and there's so many. There's so
Yeah.
many.
Right. So if a guy can kill a dove with a baseball by accident,
Yeah.
anything could happen.
Well, and what I like about that poem too is, it's not, you're not just saying that, you're not just saying, well, if a guy can kill a dove, anything can happen.
Right.
It starts off almost funny, you're talking about these, people concerned about these cryptids and whatnot. And it's teetering towards humor. And then you descend into, very thoughtful and beautiful and poetic, interpretations of things. And, it saves itself from becoming just comical. It comes back to being that sort of transcendent opening of poetry.
Yes, I think that's and I think that's what you're trying to do too, is that part of with the poem that you read is that you when you write a poem, you're trying to open something.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written a lot of essays too, which I assume you have too if you have a graduate degree. And I much prefer writing poems.
Oh, I do too. I mean, I like essay, but they function differently. They think differently,
Mhm.
and they have different purposes.
And I find essay writing kind of boring at this point because because the purpose, it seems to me, is to tell people something. Do you understand? You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah, I find myself a little frustrated with them sometimes, and
Mhm.
and part of that might be that. I mean, I do enjoy writing essay, but I think poetry is more natural to me and the way that I think about things. Um, there's a conversation I have with my mom over and over again because she doesn't like poetry and she doesn't understand
Oh,
poetry, and she's always saying to me, she's like, "Why can't you just say what you mean?" And I, of course, tell her like, I'm saying exactly what I mean in the exact way that I mean it. Whereas in an essay, I feel like you're kind of laboring to explain things. Whereas poetry is more like you're saying precisely what you mean in precisely the way that you think. I feel like the way I think is more like a poem than an essay.
mhm.
Um,
Also,
which
I think I have kind of reached a point in my life where I no longer want to tell anyone anything or be told anything by anybody.
that's fair. That's fair.
You know, and yeah. So if a poem's not trying to tell people anything, what's it trying to do?
I think that poems are trying to wrestle with something. I used to think that the theory I used to have was that poems are like presenting our great experiences, like, and by great, I mean like anything, destabilizing or transcendent or, um, ecstatic in some way. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I think that poems are trying to wrestle with the like problems that arise out of that, because I don't think you can be having an experience that's like ecstatic or traumatic and there's not something that you have to then wrestle with. And so I think poems are, they're doing that wrestling. It's like you like R.S. Thomas. I
I
think
do.
we've talked about him before. He has a line in one of his poems that says, "The strong angels wrestled and were not inclined to give him the verdict." And I read that line and I think that is what poems are doing. It's that there are strong angels wrestling and they're not inclined to give you the verdict. Um, and I'm not going to explain what that means.
The yes, I think just going back to what you were saying about your mother, I think that is a common misconception that most people have about poems, which is that a poem, that a really good poem, there's not very much to understand. Like that you're not supposed to necessarily understand a poem in the way you are an essay. You're supposed to experience it.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Mm-hmm. And does it seem to you like maybe that's the problem? Maybe we live in a culture where people are so shut down in a way that experiencing anything at that kind of poetic level is hard.
Maybe. Maybe. It depends probably on the person. Because I do think that there's a lot of what you're describing there, a lot of that kind of shutdown or any kind of higher level thinking is hard. But I think too that there's a lot of desire for the transcendent and for meaning, and poetry fills a lot of that. So I don't think poetry's in any particular danger.
No, I don't think so either. But I said, let me say two things. One is that when I say that, I think I mean that we live in a culture where our formative values are not heart opening. That our formative values are essentially consumeristic and sort of career driven and that sort of thing. And those aren't necessarily the same values that open a person's poetic receptivity, either as a reader or as a writer.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Right?
I don't think it's universal, but I think it's true.
What's that?
I said I don't think it's universal, but I think that's generally true. Yes.
Yeah, that we live in a culture. Well, I don't think it's a shock to say that contemporary American culture is not one that values the poetic highly.
True. Yes.
Okay. At the same time, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but I have certainly noticed a great upsurge of interest in poets and poetry, particularly kind of in right of center spaces online, which is very heartening to me and something I hadn't expected. But you're nodding. You've noticed that too?
I have, yeah, and I'm also very heartened by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, for me, I'm heartened by it because, I'm a Christian, and I wasn't always a Christian. I had many years where I wasn't. And when I was in school for poetry and doing a lot of writing, then I was not a Christian. And so the landscape of poetry does lean very hard left, very atheistic. And then I became a Christian and, had to then think pretty deeply about how does this change my relationship to poetry? I had to kind of hunt out different poets that then spoke to my condition as a Christian with a relationship with God that I didn't have before.
And whom did you find?
Well, R.S. Thomas, for one.
Right. Uh-huh.
R.S. Thomas. I found.
Let's talk about him for a minute.
Oh, I would love to talk about him. Sure.
What do you want to say about R.S. Thomas?
That he is supremely underrated.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I found R.S. Thomas just a few years ago, after having spent my whole life reading and writing poetry, being educated in the literary canon. Never encountered R.S. Thomas.
Right.
And I can't believe that.
Right.
I found him in an anthology. Yes, I have the same one.
I have his collected poems sitting right here next to me. Yeah.
I do too. So anyway, he was never taught to me until I sort of found him on my own. And I'm just gobsmacked by that because he was writing 100 years, well, a little less than 100 years ago, but he was around 100 years ago, and his preoccupations and his concerns are so present for today. And he really does all the things that we're talking about of what poetry really is and does. And he touches the transcendent, and he's wrestling with his relationship with the divine and the changes in the world. And it's just,
what comes across to me is the hardness of his poems. His poems are hard, not in the sense that they're difficult, but there's a stony quality to them. I don't know how to say it more than that. He was Welsh, and he writes often about Wales. And sometimes he writes about Wales in such a way that he almost comes across as not liking it at all. Right?
Very ambivalent.
Yes. And I suppose when I say there's something stony in them, they're very unflinching in their description of poverty and of the state of the world.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I don't think he's a poet you read for solace.
That's really interesting. I think it depends.
That may be true.
I actually have been finding a lot of solace in him, and especially his later poems. I think because I've just gone through such an intense sickness, and the suffering of it was out of this world. And so the things that I've been finding solace in, or maybe a little unusual, but I'm finding solace in that kind of unflinching look at the difficulty of being in this broken, fallen world, and God's occasional silence, and just the difficulty of our relationship with him through suffering sometimes.
Is there a poem in this book or of R.S. Thomas's that you particularly like?
Yes, there is. I think it's the one that I quoted. I think that line is in that poem that I just keep coming back to. It's at the very end. Well, I really like that whole last section. I think it was from a collection titled "Experimenting with an Amen," and that is just an outstanding title. But on page 521, there's a poem called "This One."
This one. Do you want to read it?
I would love to read it. This one. Sometimes a shadow passed between him and the light. Sometimes a light showed itself in the darkness beyond. Could it be? The strong angels wrestled and were not disposed to give him the verdict. Are there journeys without destinations? The animals paused and became gargoyles beside the way. And this one, standing apart to confer with the eternal, was he blamed for reaction? There is always laughter out of the speeding vehicles for the man who is still, halfway though he be in a better direction. From receding horizons, he has withdrawn his mind for greater repose on an inner perspective, where love is the bridge between thought and time. Consumers of distance at vast cost, what do they know of the green twig with which he divines, where life balances excess of death, the bottomless water that is the soul's glass?
Yeah, that's wonderful, isn't it? What do you like about that?
I love, not just the line that I quoted earlier about the angels wrestling and not giving the verdict. I love the line, there is always laughter out of the speeding vehicles for the man who is still, halfway though he be in a better direction. That resonates so strongly with me, especially as like a stay-at-home mom, where, I'm not building a career right now. I'm home with small children. I'm wiping noses and butts. Right. There's a way in which I'm standing very still, but I feel like that's halfway in a better direction. And often in our culture, that begets laughter out of the speeding vehicles.
Right. Yes.
So, and I mean, not just as a stay-at-home mom, but I think that applies to anybody who really actively chooses a more still, more quiet, more contemplative kind of life.
What he means when he says laughter out of the vehicles for the man who's standing still, this is what I mean by when I say a culture that is sort of arranged against the poetic.
Yes, absolutely.
We're referring to the same thing.
Yes, absolutely, you are.
Are there poets other than R.S. Thomas that you like a lot?
In general, or Christian specifically?
In general, that matter to you in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Emily Dickinson is, obviously the ultimate of all time.
Why do you like it? Why does she matter to you?
That's a good. Why does she matter to me? I mean, very cliche to say, but there's some measure of identification with her. But I appreciate that she was prolific. She was almost totally unconcerned with audience, like we were talking about, which I think is what allowed her to do what she did, which is have this incredible corpus of just everything going on inside of her. And some of it's pretty inscrutable because, that was just what was inside of her and coming out. She wrestles theologically with things, which I think is also criminally not talked about enough, is just her like theological poems. It's much more fashionable nowadays to talk about like her master letters and, her relationship with her sister-in-law and was she a lesbian? And I think those are like, smaller questions than like the really transcendent stuff that she was wrestling with a lot. Like she has some poems where in just like a brevity of lines presses her finger against like, the same like problems with Calvinism, for instance, that I perceive to be problems with Calvinism. It's like, man, instead of like an essay in 5 or 6 lines, she's like, this is a little weird about Calvinism. And that's not to necessarily say anything bad about Calvinists or anything. I'm not that way, but I appreciate her ability to do that. And I mean, there's a reason we're still talking about her today, and she's still so popular today. I think she does what we're talking about in terms of what poetry is and does better than most anybody.
Okay, so Emily Dickinson.
Emily Dickinson. There's a poet, Bridget Pagine Kelly. I don't know if you know her.
The name sounds vaguely familiar, but tell me.
She was pretty modern. She's since passed away, but she has 3 volumes of poetry, and her poems are probably like the most kindred to my own, I think. She was actually recommended to me by a friend who was like, hey, I've been reading this poet and she reminds me of you. And then I opened her up and it was just, she blew me away.
Yeah.
So she's pretty important to me as one of my all-time favorites. A lot of my teachers of poetry have been very influential on me. So those are just a few.
Very good. And what are your recommendations for if somebody wants to start reading poems? And let's start with Emily Dickinson.
To start reading poems?
Who wants to make poetry a bigger part of his or her life?
I would recommend, Emily Dickinson you could start with if she speaks to you. I think some people find her very difficult, though. I would maybe find an anthology and just browse through and see who speaks to you. That's what I did with like explicitly Christian poetry. Was I got an anthology of devotional poetry and just reading through it, you'll find who speaks to you, who resonates with you. And then you look at more of their work, you find people that are like them. You look at who's published them and you look at who that publisher is also publishing. And you just kind of have to follow a rabbit trail, I think. I don't think there's like any one poet that you can recommend as a starting point for somebody trying to get into poetry.
But in terms of what's the right attitude for a person to bring if they want to sort of incorporate poetry into their life? How do they do that and not be discouraged if they read a poem they don't understand?
Well, if you read a poem and you don't understand it, I think there are 2 things. You can read it again and again, or you can set it aside and keep moving and find something that starts to speak to you and your condition and resonates with you.
I think the best thing, in my experience, the best poems are those that I can't turn away from, but I also don't understand.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
That's what
definitely.
you're looking for. That's
Yeah.
like the golden egg. The poem
Yeah.
that you love but don't know what it's about.
Yeah, I would agree with that, I think.
hmm
Because then you turn it over a lot and it makes you think more deeply about poetry and how it's working. So that
hmm
would be a good place to start.
Yes. So don't be discouraged if you don't understand. That's the point I'm getting.
Yes.
Right. That if you don't understand, you might be on the right path.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for talking.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been great.
Great. Okay. You're on Twitter. Do you have a website or anything that where people could go and read some poems by you?
Um, I don't have a website. You could look me up. I mostly until now have published under my maiden name,
Mm,
which I'm fine with.
right.
But yeah, I mean, my
What is
Twitter
your maiden
is
name?
Zanotti. So Kelly Zanotti, if
Okay.
you
So
are
someone
looking
could
for.
Google that and find your
Yes.
poems.
Yes. But I have my Twitter.
Right.
I talk about poetry a little bit on there.
Well,
Mostly
what is your
it's
Twitter handle?
it is at throwing it.
Throwing
Throw
it.
spelled THROE, as in I am in the throes of it.
There you go.
So that's
Okay. Well,
important.
thank you again.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
All right. Talk soon.